In light of a turbulent 12 months for football, whether that be down to protests against the European Super League, or more recently Chelsea being taken under state control, there has been a lot of talk about fan ownership. Last Sunday, as Chelsea faced Newcastle United in the clash of dirty cash, Jamie Carragher commented before the game began that it is, quote, hard to see the fans owning a football club. That is an interesting observation, in some respects, given the fact that 8 out of the last 11 Champions League winners have been majority fan-owned football clubs, with the 3 exceptions all being English clubs, and 2 of those having been Chelsea themselves. Indeed, in a great many countries, whether that be Germany, Brazil, Norway, Sweden, Angola, Argentina, and Portugal, fan ownership of football clubs is either the norm or is actually mandated by law, in order to safeguard clubs which are considered to be integral to their local communities. And yet, in the context of Chelsea, Jamie Carragher is right. It is hard to envisage an elite-level football club in England being fan-owned anytime soon. Though, I would argue that says more about English football than it does about the various models of fan ownership. It is those various models that I wanted to explore in this video though, since there is no flat-pack fan ownership model that all clubs follow. There is actually a great deal of variation. As I said, there are a plethora of countries and leagues in which all or almost all of the clubs are fan-owned, so I was spoilt for choice as to who to include. But I've tried to pick out 7 especially interesting examples, ranging from some of the biggest clubs in world football to some you may never have even heard of before. To be clear, to meet my definition of being fan-owned, and I think most people's definition of the term, over 50% of a club's outstanding shares must be owned by the supporters, members, or some kind of supporters trust. Here are 7 interesting examples of genuinely fan-owned football clubs. 7th, Real Madrid. When I tweeted over the weekend, in response to Jamie Carragher's comments in regard to Chelsea, that both Bayern Munich and Real Madrid were fan-owned, among many other clubs, I received a whole series of responses claiming that the Spanish and German giants weren't really fan-owned. Sure, the fans might own most of the shares in name, but in practice, that means very little. Of course, the fact that the fans do own the majority of the shares in the club, by its very definition, means that they are fan-owned, so those people are wrong. But they raise an interesting and very valid point nonetheless, so I thought I'd start off with a look at arguably the biggest fan-owned football club in the entire world, and, most likely, the biggest club in world football full stop. Unlike Bayern Munich, who are 75% fan-owned, with Adidas, Audi, and Allianz each owning 8.33% of the club's shares, Real Madrid are entirely owned by their members, or socios. There used to be lots of completely fan-owned football clubs in Spain, but at the beginning of the 1990s, sports clubs were mandated to restructure themselves as SADs, a special type of public limited company, in order to ensure greater transparency and accountability over their finances. There was an exception, however, for clubs who could display that they had made a profit for each of the previous 5 seasons. Only 4 clubs could do that, namely Barcelona, Real Madrid, Athletic Club and Osasuna, and 30 years later, they remain the only fully fan-owned teams in La Liga. Out of all 4, Real Madrid are the least democratic. The club's 90,000 socios pay an annual fee of €123 in order to maintain their ownership stake and vote on key decisions, unless they have been a member for over 50 years, at which point membership becomes free. To become a socio, your application must be endorsed by 2 existing members. Real Madrid's directors, and indeed their president, which is currently Florentino Perez, also have to have been long-serving members, though that isn't the only requirement to sit on the board. You also have to be extremely rich. How rich, you ask? Well, board members have to be able to prove that they could provide 15% of the club's annual turnover in the form of a bank guarantee at the beginning of every season. Given that Real Madrid's turnover is about €700 million, 15% amounts to more than €100 million, an amount that the average Real Madrid socio, unsurprisingly, is unlikely to be able to guarantee. Perez, for example, is estimated to be worth somewhere in the region of €2 billion. To challenge Perez in Real Madrid's last presidential elections, you had to have at least €124 million to your name and to have been a socio for the last 20 years. What's more, Real Madrid fans don't actually vote directly on important issues relating to how their club is run, as they ought to, in theory. Instead, socios elect a representative to vote on their behalf, similar to how we in the United Kingdom elect a member of parliament to represent each of our constituencies, and they then get to vote in parliament on our behalf. At Real Madrid, however, even these elected representatives don't get much of a say on really major decisions taken by the club, such as the €400 million renovation of the Santiago Bernabeu, the decision to fund it through debt, and the taking on of a stadium sponsor to increase revenue, which would mean changing the stadium's name. It must be said that the other three fan-owned La Liga teams, whilst far from perfect, are rather more democratic than Real Madrid, and do engage in some direct democracy and hold genuine presidential elections, where one member has one vote. Sixth, Exeter City. Of the two clubs that get us started in this 7, one is an all-conquering behemoth of the European game, and the other is Real Madrid. Alright, Exeter City might seem like a bit of a come-down in terms of current stature, but they do have a story and a past leading up to their current ownership situation that is as fascinating as just about any other clubs. One of only 2 majority fan-owned football clubs within English football's top 4 divisions, so that is the EFL and the Premier League, English football's other fan-owned football league team is AFC Wimbledon, but I am planning on making an entire documentary about them at some stage, so it is Exeter who take the limelight for now. Founded in 1904, the club is perhaps best known for their tour of South America in 1914. It was originally supposed to be Tottenham Hotspur, who were touring South America, but after they pulled out due to travel expenses, the Grecians offered to take the journey instead. Exeter played 11 games in total, 8 in Argentina and 3 in Brazil, but it was the last of those 11, in Brazil, which proved to be the most significant, as Exeter became the very first opponents of the Brazilian national team, who are now the most celebrated and successful national team in the entire world. It would be fair to say that Exeter are not the most celebrated or successful club team in the world, and back in 2003, this historic club looked to be on the precipice. For the first time since they became a Football League team, back in 1920, Exeter were relegated from the Football League. Threatened with liquidation, the Exeter City Supporters Trust took control of the club. Meanwhile, 2 of Exeter's former directors were convicted of carrying out fraudulent trading at the club. The trust worked tirelessly to raise funds and to pay the bills, through various fundraisers and a £500 Red or Dead membership scheme. That alluded to the club's perilous financial situation. It was not called that because the trust would murder you if you didn't cough up £500. Just, to avoid any confusion. Ultimately, though, it was a gift from the FA Cup gods that gave Exeter their key to survival, as they were drawn away to Manchester United and received a life-saving £653,511 cash injection as their cut of the gate receipts. Better still, Exeter managed a draw at Old Trafford, giving them another big payday via a replay back at St James's Park. Exeter regained their Football League status in 2008 after they won the Conference Playoff Final, and they are currently 5th in League Two, looking good value for a playoff spot and quite possibly a challenge for automatic promotion. Only 53.9% of shares in Exeter City Football Club are officially owned by the Exeter City AFC Supporters Society Limited, but there are no other shareholders owning in excess of 10% of the club shares. Interestingly, or, I thought so at least, 12.77% of Exeter City Football Club is owned by untraceable shareholders, which is mostly made up of supporters who bought a tiny number of shares dating all the way back to the 1930s during various rounds of fundraising, many of whom are now dead, but the shares were never passed on to their relatives. The more you know, eh? 5th, Bohemians. To English football fans, who dream of their clubs being bought by increasingly rich and despicable despots and billionaires so that they can lord it over all of their mates who support other clubs that they now have an even bigger at owning their club than them, the idea of fan ownership seems utopian and idealistic. A sort of hippy-dippy dream of peace, love and harmony, which is restricted only to libtards, vegans, and social justice warriors. Alright, I'm exaggerating a little, but there is definitely an idea of fan-owned football clubs being somehow utopian and harmonious, with fans singing Kumbaya around a campfire as they decide who they should sign next season and whether to renovate the changing rooms. Of course, that isn't the reality of most fan-owned football clubs, if any, and Bohemians are a great example of that. One of the best-known teams, internationally at least, in the Czech Republic, Bohemians 1905, as their name suggests, were founded in 1905, though they have only ever won one league title, back in 1983, before the breakup of Czechoslovakia. Nonetheless, Bohemians have gained a cult-like affection among some football fans due to their club badge, nickname, and supporters. Bohemians went on a tour of Australia in 1927, which would have been one hell of a trip at the time, and before they returned to Europe, they were gifted 2 live kangaroos by their Australian hosts. Well, it would have been a bit weird to give them 2 dead kangaroos, wouldn't it? Like some kind of Australian mafia version of the severed horse head in The Godfather. I suppose they could have been stuffed dead kangaroos like those taxidermy animals that you get. That would be a bit less weird, but they weren't. They were very much alive. Bohemians, being a football club and all, weren't really sure what to do with the kangaroos, so they donated them to the Prague Zoo. But their badge and nickname are a legacy of that tour and of those 2, and I reiterate, live kangaroos. Well, they're probably dead now. Bohemians have historically been one of the best supported teams in the Czech Republic, and they are the only fan-owned club in the Czech First League. Synonymous with the great Antonin Panenka, who the Panenka penalty is named after, the Euro 76 shootout winner is now Bohemians club president. Although Bohemian supporters, who own their club, are generally considered to lean left politically, there is also a distinct right-wing faction of Bohemians fans. Consequently, different supporters groups at Bohemians have relationships with different clubs, whether that be broadly left-wing clubs like St. Pauli and AS Trenčín, or more right-leaning clubs such as Lokomotiv Leipzig. Bohemians' left and right-wing factions have been known to get into some pretty nasty fights over the years, so whilst fan ownership might give supporters a greater say in how their clubs are run, do not assume that it is a prerequisite for harmonious supporter relations. 4th, Deportivo Cali. Sticking with the theme of fan-owned clubs, in countries where fan ownership isn't the norm, unlike in a number of Latin American countries, Colombia has no rules around fan ownership, and fan ownership certainly is not the norm. In fact, Deportivo Cali are the only fan-owned professional football club, at least as far as I'm aware, and I am of course an all-seeing, all-knowing and all-powerful god when it comes to these types of things, in the Categoria Primera A, which is Colombian football's top flight, and in Colombian football more broadly. That meant that during the 1970s and 80s, when narco money flooded into Colombian football, whether that be the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar bankrolling Atlético Nacional, or the Cali cartel and the Rodriguez Orejuelo brothers throwing their weight behind Deportivo's rivals, América de Cali, Deportivo Cali continued to be owned and operated by their members. Perhaps it is little surprise then that as money poured into those other clubs, Deportivo Cali struggled to compete, failing to win a league title between the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, the exact period in which narco cash took hold of the Colombian game. 10-time title winners in Colombia, Deportivo have also lifted the Copa Libertadores twice, once in 1978 and once in 1999. Although Deportivo Cali enjoys strong support, regularly seeing crowds in excess of 10,000 prior to the pandemic, and able to sell out their 44,000 capacity home ground for the very biggest of occasions, they only actually have around 2,000 fully paid up members who actually own the club. Fan ownership certainly doesn't seem to have done Deportivo any harm though, given the fact that they are the reigning Colombian champions, they are frequently ranked by Forbes as the most valuable sports team in Colombia, and they are one of the most valuable in the entire Americas. Third, SV Austria Salzburg. A quick heads up to say that I might struggle with images in this segment, since Getty images are rather lacking when it comes to photographs of SV Austria Salzburg in their database. But I will do my best to provide you with a visual feast for your eyes nonetheless, using whatever images I can find to accompany my wretched voice. SV Austria Salzburg were first founded in 1933 during a merger of Hertha and Rapid Salzburg, and 20 years later, in 1953, after Austria had been annexed by Nazi Germany, World War II had ended, and the Second Republic of Austria had been declared, SV Austria Salzburg reached the top flight for the first time. Fast forward more than 50 years to 2005, and the Austrian energy drink giants Red Bull, who are headquartered in Salzburg, along with their co-founder and CEO Dietrich Mateschitz, were looking to get into the football business. When Red Bull acquired SV Austria Salzburg, some supporters may have been initially excited. Red Bull is one of the biggest companies in Austria, and Mateschitz is by far the wealthiest person in the country. Unfortunately, however, as SV Austria Salzburg fans soon discovered, Mateschitz and Red Bull weren't particularly interested in upholding any of SV Austria Salzburg's history or tradition. The new owners immediately changed the club's name and colours, with Mateschitz proudly declaring, "This is a new club with no history." That came as news to SV Austria Salzburg fans. Their team were three-time Austrian Bundesliga champions, including a title less than a decade ago, and they had reached a UEFA Cup final as recently as 1994. What about their club? What about their history? Following some backlash, supposedly in an effort to appease existing SV Austria Salzburg fans, Red Bull offered to preserve the colours of SV Austria Salzburg, which were violet and white, by allowing their goalkeeper to wear purple socks for away matches. No, I am not joking. And yes, sometimes it is best to just say nothing at all. So in 2005, after their club was stolen from them, SV Austria Salzburg fans refounded SV Austria Salzburg, making them an entirely fan-owned club. Of course, they lost their place in the Austrian Bundesliga, which had been taken by Red Bull Salzburg, so they had to start out in the 5th tier. They also lost their stadium, as the Red Bull franchise moved into the brand new Red Bull Arena, and their former home ground, the Stadion Lehen, was demolished in 2006. When SV Austria Salzburg climbed all the way back up to Austrian football's 2nd tier, they had to take on €900,000 of debt to get their ground up to division standards. And when they contravened league rules by seeking external funding, they were handed a 6-point deduction. SV Austria Salzburg currently compete in the Regionalliga Salzburg, which is the 3rd tier of Austrian football. Meanwhile, Red Bull Salzburg have won the last 8 Austrian Bundesliga titles in a row and already have an 11-point lead at the top of the league this season. Second, Hearts. The biggest fan-owned football club in the entire United Kingdom, with apologies to Hull United, but I am afraid it is true. Given the inertia in England's top 2 divisions to move towards fan ownership, the biggest threat to Hearts' status as the biggest fan-owned football club in the UK is probably Indy Ref 2. Hearts, full name Heart of Midlothian FC, are the oldest and most successful club from Scotland's capital, and they enjoy, at least when they're winning, one of the biggest rivalries in Scottish football against Hibernian, with very little distance separating the two clubs' home grounds. Hearts are 4-time champions of Scottish football and 8-time Scottish Cup winners, most recently in 2012. In 2013, however, Hearts entered administration with debts of £25 million, including £15 million that they owed to a Lithuanian bank, Ūkio Bankas, which had just gone bankrupt. Hearts were owned by the Russian-Lithuanian businessman Vladimir Romanov at the time, who is currently wanted by the Lithuanian authorities over allegations of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Following a 15-point deduction, Hearts were relegated from the Scottish Premiership for the first time since 1981. The club was eventually saved and brought out of administration by 74-year-old Scottish businesswoman Anne Budge, who sold her tech business for a reported £30 million back in 2005. Budge brought stability to Hearts, along with an immediate return to the top flight. In the truncated 2019-20 season, however, which was cut short due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Hearts were relegated on a points-per-game basis. They won promotion as Scottish Championship title winners last season, and following that success, Budge transferred ownership of the club over to the Foundation of Hearts Supporters Group. Members are now able to own a slice of the club that they love, almost like dissecting Hearts, you could say, though I am sure that it is much less bloody and requires zero medical expertise. As of last month, Hearts had raised over £13 million in pledges from supporters for their new fan-owned project, and they are currently third in the Scottish Premiership table, miles behind Rangers in second, but also miles ahead of their rivals Hibernian in fourth. First, Clarksvika ite Trafale. If there's one thing that people come up and say to me on the street more than anything else, it has to be, "Oi, mate, what are you doing with that pangolin?" But the second most frequent thing that people say to me is, "Why don't you make more videos about football in the Faroe Islands? Is it because, as we all suspect, you are a xenophobe who is horribly bigoted against the fine Faroese people?" Yeah, alright, they don't say that to me very often either, but supposing that they did, I would be keen to push back against those allegations since I have nothing against the Faroe Islands, and I might do that by putting a Faroese football club top of one of my sevens. Clarksvika ite Trafale are that club, and yes, if any Faroese people are watching, I am sure that is not how you pronounce it. But no one likes a clever dick, and if we're talking about football in the Faroe Islands, there are few better places to start than Clarksvika ite Trafale. Founded in 1904, the same year as East Yorkshire's finest, of course, hence why I have such a natural affinity towards them, Clarksvika ite Trafale, who are thankfully better known as KI, which is how I will be referring to them from now on, have won the Faroe Islands Premier League 19 times, which is the most of any club, and they are the reigning champions, having won last season's title. That means that KI have competed in plenty of Champions League, Europa League, and most recently Conference League qualifiers, though, sadly, they are yet to reach the group stage of any UEFA competition. KI are fan-owned, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have put them top of this seven, and unlike Real Madrid, who we began this seven by talking about, the supporters who own KI do get a real say in how their club is run. That is probably why KI weren't part of the failed European Super League breakaway and Real Madrid were, assuming that KI were asked, and I would be mightily surprised if they weren't, given that they are quite so super. There are 11 different types of KI membership, 8 of which are just memberships for different child age groups, with adult membership split into Tier 1, 2, and 3 memberships. All animals are equal, of course, but some are more equal than others. Memberships start at the equivalent of just over £100 in Danish kroner, rising to £170, and KI are one of the best supported teams in the Faroe Islands, averaging around 700 to 900 fans a game, which isn't bad going in a country of fewer than 50,000 people. As a percentage of the Faroe Islands' total population, it would be equivalent to an English football club regularly getting crowds of over 900,000 at their games. So that is it for today's video. There are very many other teams who I could have included, whether that be Barcelona, Athletic Club, most of Germany, Argentina, Brazil, AFC Wimbledon, Porto, Benfica, the list goes on and on. But I hope that you enjoyed the 7 that I featured, and if that was the case, feel free to hit the like button. You can also leave a comment if you have anything to say, whether it is of interest or not, and make sure you're subscribed, of course, to HITC Sevens. It would be foolish not to. And you can also find me on social media on either Twitter or Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.